Every exquisite stroke of caramel brown, silken white and ominous black that makes up this stunning portrait was cast by the brilliant James Northcote in 1826. Northcote made a fortune painting the cream of English society in the 1800s, from moneyed socialites to military men and nobility. So let's go ahead and interrogate the elephant in the room. What was he doing painting a striking, richly dressed, free black man 7 years before slavery was completely outlawed across the British Empire? And why did Northcote hide a message in his subject's wandering eyes? It's story time. Once an undergrad looking to kill time, yours truly strolled into the UK's Manchester Art Gallery. It was my first visit, and I fancied myself something of an art critic at the time, probably less John Ruskin and more Ignatius J. Riley. On the gallery's first or second floor, I can't quite remember which, one painting caught my eye. It was this one. Wall after wall, corridor after corridor depicted epic-looking white men with equally epic-looking beards, and chocolate box moments in European history or mythos, I can't quite remember which. But this portraiture possessed a tiny, lonely corner of the gallery. Mimicking the well-worn emoji, its subject's eyes seemed to say to me, "Don't ask my guy, man don't know what he's doing there either." On an even smaller corner beside the painting, the tiniest of blurbs read something like, "Ira Aldridge as the Moor of Venice" by James Northcote, 1826. You are looking at a depiction of Shakespeare's famous fictional character, Othello. The sitter in costume as Shakespeare's Moor was a man known as Ira Frederick Aldridge. But beyond the paltry details offered by the Manchester Art Museum, who was he, and why, when I finally decided to look into him decades later, did I find painting after painting of the same man in several different costumes and settings, done by the best artists of the 19th century? Why were these European painters obsessed with the mysterious Ira Aldridge? And why did James Northcote choose to paint him so differently to how rival artists were painting him, with these shifting, almost schizophrenic eyes, as though Mr. Aldridge was on the run from something or someone? To answer this, we must closely examine this painting and Northcote's choices in his representation of Aldridge. Correction, in his representation of Othello. Because remember, we're not actually looking at Aldridge here, we're looking at Aldridge as Othello. Which begs the question, why was Aldridge dressed as Othello? Simply, he was an actor, here in character as Shakespeare's jealous Moor. Perhaps then, this is the reason Northcote's Othello has that look. Quote, "Is this the character Othello who has just been given false cause to doubt the fidelity of his beautiful wife Desdemona? Is this the very moment in which the malevolent Iago utters the notorious line from which such murderous consequences will ensue? Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is that green-eyed monster that doth mock the meat it feeds on." Close quote. So asks magnetmanchester.org in their analysis of Northcote's work. While their article fails to give a conclusive answer, one thing we know for sure is that Othello's Moorish identity is exactly why Northcote chose this strange sash to adorn his sitter's waist. Notice the distinct red and white striped pattern, a subtle yet marked divergence from the austere monochrome typical of male sartorial tastes in 19th century England. The red and white was a pattern that spoke to the Afro-Arabic influences of Moorish culture, exemplified most commonly today in the checkered patterns of red and white keffiyehs worn in the Middle East. But was that all Northcote was invoking with his Moor's patterned waistband? Well-travelled and well-educated, Northcote would have been aware of the richness of Moorish history and its contributions to European civilization. He almost certainly would have known of this: the interior of the Great Mosque of Cordoba, built by the Umayyad Emir Ar-Rahman I, which by Northcote's time had been converted into a cathedral after Europeans eventually won back Spain from Africans. Is it this distinct royal pattern reproduced again and again in Moorish architecture, art and fashion which Northcote was invoking? If so, by harking back to this rich history, Northcote seems unembarrassed by Europe's past, one in which blacks from Northwest and West Africa dominated Europe and influenced white progress, a past that was accepted as basic fact up until much recent reactionary times. The story of the Moors and their influence on European fashion, food, music, science and architecture are in the historical archives for those who dare to look. And while Moorish civilization later became a thing of equal participation between the black, white and tawny inhabitants of North Africa, at its inception it was very much a black enterprise. Northcote and many in the 19th century knew this truth even when it proved inconvenient for their theories of racial supremacy. In fact, they knew it so well that when it came to playing Othello, every thespian in Europe took to blackface. The greatest actors from the earliest renditions of Othello all blackened their faces, with even the great Laurence Olivier following suit as recently as 1965. Edmund Kean, the prodigious 19th century actor, was no different. Billed to play Othello in 1833 for the umpteenth time, and to the exclusion of the roving Ira Aldridge, he collapsed on stage at the Drury Lane Theatre in Covent Garden. Weeks later, he died. Aldridge was asked to fill the great man's shoes. And here comes the relevance of Northcote's deliciously delicate brown brush strokes. Because although undoubtedly a black man, Aldridge apparently wasn't black enough to play Othello. This just one of many excuses from critics scraping the barrel for an ill report of Aldridge's Othello. Prior to his big break in 1833, on the 11th of October 1825, a critic in the Times of London claimed Aldridge's copper complexion, as demonstrated here in Northcote's painting, was insufficiently dark to make him a feasible Othello. White men wearing shoe polish were of course more authentic. Fascinating, seeing as almost 2 centuries later, the heirs of this erudite logic now call into question whether Shakespeare's great black general was even black at all. So wondered Slate in 2015, ignoring Shakespeare's description of Othello's thick lips, sooty bosom, and likening to a quote black ram. But while Northcote is under no illusion as to the colour of his Moor, he chooses to lighten him. We know he lightens Aldridge because we actually have daguerreotypes of the celebrity actor in his life. These were copper-plated precursors to the photograph, modes of commemorating the great and the good, not readily available to the general public at the time. Here you can see Aldridge reprising what became his most famous role. Angry looking, aloof and at attention, his unsheathed scabbard is readied for action. And here in this picture, he is dressed in more relatable attire. Not dark enough indeed. Actually, those who painted Aldridge again and again often didn't stint on their black strokes, as you can see here with Aldridge in the role of Mungo in the play The Padlock, and here again as Othello. In actuality, Northcote more than likely chose the light brown in his work simply to highlight the heavy storm clouds gathering around his Othello, storms that foreground that sulphuric African yellow of Aldridge's paranoid eyes. Notice Aldridge's paranoid eyes and not Othello's. Is this look the young actor reflecting on an astonishing journey and upon his own destiny in a potentially hostile world? Asks magnetmanchester.org. That astonishing journey began westward, whither Aldridge looks, far across the Atlantic in early 19th century New York City. There, Daniel Aldridge had planned his son's destiny from birth. He too was to be a preacher. and once of age, young Ira Aldridge was sent to the African Free School, established by abolitionists to educate the quote, descendants of an injured race. Unfortunately, unremarkable as a student, at a time when all that even the best black graduates could hope to attain was back-breaking manual labor alongside less qualified whites, Aldridge's prospects were dire. Worse than dire actually, because Aldridge had started to fall hopelessly in love with acting. Enter the African Grove Theatre, also known simply as the African Theatre. Quote, from 1821 to 1823, an impresario named William Brown ran the African Theatre, the first African-American theatre company. All black productions of Richard III, Othello, and other plays were presented in downtown Manhattan. Brown did not have an easy time. Neighbors complained. The police intervened. End quote. Alex Ross, writing for The New Yorker in 2013. According to Ross, when white competitors felt threatened by the African theatre's growing popularity with working-class New Yorkers, they, quote, sent in gangs of thugs, and the newspaper editor Mordecai Manuel Noah, who also happened to be the sheriff of New York, mocked the effort by printing spoofs in black dialect. Close quote. It was at the African Theatre in New York where a teenage Aldridge landed his first acting roles. Sadly though, the show could not go on. Picture scenes from Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York, where in the film's closing stages, dissatisfied poor whites, unhappy at being drafted for the Civil War, hunted blacks indiscriminately across the streets and alleys of New York City. This was a New York Aldridge knew he had to flee if his dreams were to materialize. And in 1824, he did just that. If Aldridge had remained in America, his acting career would surely have gone nowhere. Aldridge reached England with the assistance of two acting brothers named Warlock. Close quote. Alex Ross. Only a teenager, Aldridge decides to try his luck and travel with the help of two white strangers across 1,000 leagues to an entirely unknown part of the world. Solomon Northrop might have had a word or two for the young man, but needlessly cautious these words would have proved, seeing as Aldridge's gamble pays off. His instinct proves uncanny because 2 years from Aldridge's arrival in England, New York's African Theatre is mysteriously burned to the ground, never to be rebuilt. Anti-black riots in New York during the 1830s would see black families massacred and their homes razed to the ground, and Aldridge himself, involved in a few disturbances back home, would almost certainly have died in the infamous riots of 1834. Is it this paranoia about a fate so thinly escaped which Northcote brilliantly captures in Aldridge's skew-whiff glance? Is this what Magnet Manchester refers to as Aldridge reflecting on his destiny in a hostile world? Or is there even more going on in this painting? Was there a greater secret Aldridge, and not Othello, was hiding, the presence of which he couldn't quite keep from Northcote's keen brush? Alex Ross writes that, quote, in May 1825, Aldridge made his London debut, playing Othello at the Royalty Theatre, a low-profile establishment in the East End. A critic chided this gentleman of colour lately arrived from America for his unreliable delivery of the text, but concluded that, quote, his on-stage death was certainly one of the finest physical representations of bodily anguish we ever witnessed. Aldridge was 17. Close quote. He certainly produced strong feelings in the English audiences that came to see his London debut. A curious Globe writer found his voice distinct and sonorous. But again, naysayers at the Times claimed that, quote, his figure is unlucky for the stage. He's bacon-kneed and narrow-chested, and owing to the shape of his lips, it is utterly impossible for him to pronounce English in such a manner as to satisfy even the fastidious ears of the gallery. Close quote. proud, and as if on the edge of blurting something defiant, the lips painted by Northcote's brush seem more than capable of enunciating their grievances. So capable that Aldridge's star begins to rise. Mungo was the well-established main character of The Padlock, a popular late 18th century comedy about a bumbling, drunken, singing and dancing black servant named Mungo. Lines from it were so famous they were often quoted in Parliament. But up to now, Mungo had been played by Englishmen in blackface, mimicking West Indian pidgin, a role that no doubt allowed whites to indulge their fantasies about the typical black person. When Aldridge, an actual black man, is set to play the role, this is how one newspaper advertised the billing. Theatrical dogs, horses and elephants have passed away. Those of monkeys seem to be on the decline. And now, for a more monstrous exhibition than all the rest, we are to be treated with a black actor, a right earnest African tragedian. Close quote. Quite rude, but Aldridge has a few tricks up his sleeve. Instead of merely fulfilling the racial stereotypes a baying 19th century audience wanted to see, Aldridge does something so wild you'd have to have been there to believe it. He composes his own solos and soliloquies for the play. These are lines which make the audience think, and think hard about what they are really laughing at. But crucially, they're still laughing. Alex Ross says audiences turning up looking to see the greatest of freak shows, a comedy within a comedy, instead, quote, encountered a performer of skill and refinement. Aldridge biographer Bernth Lindfors suggests that they were left with a chastened appreciation of black virtuosity. Close quote. Whilst still making audiences laugh, Aldridge brought a dignity to Mungo's character, adding a pathos to the role never before seen by an English audience. His effect on British theatre goers is, quote, dizzying, not too far off the effect on his own career. He lands more roles and tours the country playing Orinoco, a mythical African prince who wages war against whites. Again, Aldridge's performances are praised almost universally, if begrudgingly by some. But part of Aldridge's success so far is based on a lie, and that lie could well have been the secret in his eyes. Faced with the threat of being blackballed for his race at the start of his English career, Aldridge is desperate. He cannot go back to America. In Europe, a man was freer. In Europe, Aldridge was more than a nigger. In England, he was a blackamoor. In Germany, moren. In Greece, maros. And the luminescent memories these names invoked east of the Atlantic still carried some respect. So he claimed to be the descendant of Fulani princes from the Zagawa Empire, a former Senegambian superpower sporadically involved in past Moorish conquests of southern Europe. He even began traveling from town to town in a fantastic caravan, calling himself the African Roscius, Roscius being an acting great of ancient Rome. The lie worked. Audiences loved Aldridge's creation and believed they were coming to see an authentic Moorish prince play the role of Shakespeare's Moor. Is Aldridge here in Northcote's painting waiting for his public relations concoction to be outed? Did he sit for this portrait while touring Manchester in 1826 with the fear of being discovered gnawing away at his mind? Was Aldridge shocked to see his inner spasm captured by Northcote? And did he beg Northcote to modify his uncontrolled look only for the painter to stubbornly refuse? Or perhaps, despite the Moorish sash, in Aldridge's mind, Northcote's choice of costume was insufficiently exotic to sell his ongoing fiction. Here, Northcote's artistry gives the impression of a simplistic, subtly luxurious silk shirt, not too dissimilar from the day clothes of an English squire. Aldridge even comes complete with a gold-collared neckerchief. If this was meant to reflect the actor's growing status and not merely Othello's, it wasn't far from accurate. Aldridge certainly would have been able to afford the clothes in this painting as his career advanced, despite the hiccups. After Edmund Kean's death, and with it the death of his blackface Othello, in 1833 the Theatre Royal in Covent Garden offered Aldridge a run as Othello, and in 1830s England there were fewer stages bigger than this. Aldridge's enemies came out to play. Keen to finally take out the aberration haunting English playhouses, Alex Ross recounts that, quote, much of the London press made a project of taking him down. The Figaro in London launched a breathtakingly vile campaign, promising to inflict on Aldridge, quote, such a chastisement as must drive him from the stage he is dishonoured, and force him to find in the capacity of footman or street sweeper that level for which his colour appears to have rendered him peculiarly qualified. Close quote. The Athenaeum was scandalised to see Ellen Tree, who played Desdemona, being pawed about by a black man. Close quote. After only a handful of performances, the theatre closed the play and Aldridge was dismissed. We've hunted the from the boards, boasted the Figaro. But not for long. A one-man army, Aldridge regrouped away from London, performing Othello in regional theatres where some had never seen a black man before, let alone an acting, singing, emoting one. He even goes to Ireland, and when the Irish hear how hated Aldridge is in London, they love him even more. On the Emerald Isle, where the people were considered by the British to be just a step above blacks, Aldridge becomes an out-and-out star. Ever the master at playing a crowd, Aldridge flatters his Irish audience with one of the many improvised compositions he has become known for. Here the sable African was free from every bond save those which kindness threw around his heart and bound it fast to you. Cheers rang out. The Irish seemed to be in love. Everywhere Aldridge went that wasn't London, he was well received, to the point that he was soon begged to return and perform Shakespeare for Londoners once more. Yes, London's calling, but no one's answering, because by the 1840s, 50s and 60s, Aldridge had gone continental. He's invited to perform in Switzerland, Belgium, Poland, even Russia. In these countries, he performs no longer on common stages, but at grand halls in front of counts, countesses, kings and queens. And crucially, these audiences now insist that Aldridge plays more than black roles. Instead, they demand that Aldridge plays white characters. Quite amazingly, Aldridge obliges. Turning the tables with glee, he paints his face white and plays Macbeth, Shylock, Richard III and King Lear. The result is phenomenal. As Macbeth, one critic said he captured the, quote, terrible battle of noble-mindedness with the demon of ambition, leaving an indelible impression on the German Duke of Saxe-Meiningen, whose acting company would apparently go on to change theatre forever. French poet and critic Théophile Gautier saw Aldridge in Russia again and again, and Gautier was awestruck. J.A. Rogers quotes the French poet in his book World's Great Men of Colour. Quote, he was the Lion of St. Petersburg, and it was necessary to engage a seat several days in advance. Aldridge's entrance was magnificent, with his eyes half closed as if dazzled by the African sun. He was Othello himself, as Shakespeare had created him. He had that nonchalance, that oriental attitude, that désinvolture of a Negro that no European is able to imitate. He produced an immense effect and received interminable applause. Gautier even went as far as to say that when he played King Lear in Whiteface, Aldridge's onstage daughter, Cordelia, would, quote, not have guessed that she had a Negro for her father. Aldridge, though as the height of his physical power, did not betray by a single movement that he was a younger man. The voice, the step, the gestures were all those of an octogenarian." Close quote. High praise, but surely this was just sensationalized reportage from a French groupie. But what's this? Reports from German audiences also? J.A. Rogers again. In Germany, he found himself the subject of mass adulation, with full houses greeting him in each town and critics vying with one another to invent superlatives. One critic suggested that Aldridge might be the greatest of all actors. Another said that since the time of the ancient kings of the Athenian stage, no one has seen anything like it. And a Viennese critic said, "Ira Aldridge is without a doubt the greatest actor that has ever been seen in Europe." Close quote. Long before the 20th century began, Aldridge's excellence forced Europeans to see past skin color. But here's the incredible thing about Aldridge's talent. Before people had a word for it, he actually pioneered method acting. Quote, "Ira Aldridge is critical of some of the more formalized, declamatory acting styles of the period, as exemplified by actors like Charles Kemble, who would seem quite stilted, almost comical, if we could see them today." Close quote. Robin Brion in 2014 on AmericanTheatre.org. Yes, men like Konstantin Stanislavski are today officially credited with the invention of method acting. But those who saw Aldridge perform would have begged to differ, because before Stanislavski's diagrams swallowed an art form into rigid, compartmentalized academia, Aldridge donned an onstage swagger that was impossible to teach. Listen again to J.A. Rogers citing a Russian theatre-goer from 1850. "The scene in the third act, when the sentiment of jealousy is aroused in the ferocious Moor, is the triumph of Aldridge. As the first word of the wily insinuation, you see his eyes kindle. You feel the tears in his voice when he questions Iago, then the deep sob which stifles it. And finally, when he is persuaded that his wretchedness is complete, a cry, or rather a roar, like that of a wild beast, starts from his abdomen. I seem to hear that cry yet. It chilled us with fear and made every spectator shudder. Tears wet his cheek, his mouth foamed and his eyes flashed fire. I have never seen an artist identify himself so perfectly with the character he represented. An actor told me that he heard him sob after his exit from the scene. Everybody, men, women and children, wept. Boileau was right in saying to actors, weep yourself if you will make others weep. Close quote. And Errol Hill, in his 1984 book Shakespeare in Sable, proposes that Aldridge deserves credit for introducing greater naturalism into the Victorian theatre. With such an amount of success also came money. A shirt like this would have been nothing for Aldridge's overflowing coffers later in his life. He bought a home in London near the Crystal Palace on Hamlet Road, no less, and other properties nearby. Frederick Wilhelm IV, the King of Prussia, conferred on Aldridge a gold medal for art and science. Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria gave him the Grand Cross of the Order of Leopold. Numerous other honours followed. His most impressive title was Chevalier Ira Aldridge, Knight of Saxony, and he did not hesitate to use it. Close quote. Alex Ross once again. And J.A. Rogers once more. Quote, Sheehan says he had honours conferred upon him by almost every crowned head in Europe, besides valuable presents from nobles. His villa residence at Upper Norwood was literally crammed with costly articles of every description received by way of presents." Close quote. Is this the paranoia in Aldridge's eyes then? Was he always carrying with him the fear that in a white world, one misstep could have it all taken away from him? Indeed, it almost certainly was, for with looks and talent came fame, with fame came money, and all three brought the problem of women. White women. Enough white women to earn him several lynchings back in Jim Crow land. Though he married young in his 20s, Aldridge was never faithful to his first wife, a devoted Englishwoman named Margaret Gill. Proof that suffering injustices yourself doesn't prevent you from inflicting them on others. Aldridge even brought home an illegitimate baby boy into Margaret's life early in their marriage. Biographer Bernth Lindfors says Margaret, quote, brought him up as if he were her own son. Aldridge's philandering would eventually see him marrying a much younger Swedish mistress a year after the death of his first wife in 1865. He left her a fortune of £9,000, well over £1 million in today's money, and with far more buying power in the late 1800s. But Aldridge could easily have paid a bigger price for his dalliances with European ladies. In 1856, an actor, William Stothard, and his actress wife Emma gave birth to a baby boy. Trouble for Emma was her son came out a little on the tan side. A furious husband sued Aldridge for criminal conversation, a Victorian euphemism for adultery. On January the 14th, a jury finds for Stothard and awards him damages. The damages don't dent Aldridge's pocket, and he ultimately escapes the scandal unscathed. Amazing, considering a similar affair had brought the career of the great Edmund Kean to a halt decades prior. But in 1856, Aldridge's charisma and celebrity is such that not only is he not facing a lynch mob in Victorian England, his career isn't slowed down one bit. Instead, Aldridge begins planning a homecoming to end all homecomings, a return tour of America. A week before he was to sail for America, Aldridge fell ill from a lung condition and died in Lodz, Poland on August the 7th, 1867. Quote, he was buried there amid such pomp as befitted the first and last Black Knight of Saxony. Whatever Aldridge seemed wary of in Northcote's painting, we'll never really know, but what we can know is the legacy he left behind. This video has hardly plumbed the depths of his illustrious career, but if you would like more takes on black history not taught in our heavily biased schooling systems, hit the like button and subscribe to the Trill Black channel. From Kush to Compton, this has been Trill Black, no doubt.